I'd like to call this meeting to order. Thank you all so much for coming. Tonight, we are holding a public hearing of the Eugene Planning Commission to consider amendments to the land use code related to where secondary dwelling units are allowed within the city. My name is Bree Nicolello, and I am the Vice Chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. John Borofsky, our chair, isn't with us this evening, so you'll be seeing me for my first time chairing a public hearing. So bear with me if I make mistakes, say your last name wrong. Mine's Nicolello. We're just going to learn together. To start, I'd like each of the commissioners to introduce themselves.
Sure. I'm Kristen Taylor.
I'm Stephen Baker.
I'm Bill Randall.
John Jaworski.
And tonight we also have the following city staff present. We have Alyssa Hansen with the Planning Division and Lauren Summers with the City Attorney's Office. I'd like to take a moment to explain who the Planning Commission is and our role. We are unpaid volunteers appointed by the Eugene City Council to 4-year terms on this commission. We all live and work in Eugene, like many of you. We directly advise our City Council on all matters related to land use and through our charter, and we are also tasked with making certain land use decisions on behalf of our City Council. The decision before you today is a legislative decision, so everybody will get the same amount of time. We've agreed on up here up to 5 minutes, if that's okay with you. But if you would like longer or shorter, please feel free to let us know. We're responsible for upholding the laws of our city and our state, the policies of our City Council, and of course, at the same time, we're also responsible to everyone who lives and works in Eugene. We're at-large members, which means we have to consider the needs of the community as a whole, as well as the needs of all groups and neighborhoods. We're also fairly normal human beings, or so we've been told, which means each one of us have personal views and biases that makes us who we are. But as planning commissioners, we're committed to balancing all of our needs as a community and to making the best decisions we can possibly make based on our policies and our laws for us and for future generations. That can be pretty tough to do, and we know that not everyone will agree. So as we proceed today, we want you to know up front that we are listening, we care deeply about you and about our community. We will listen carefully and hear your concerns and your hopes. And even though we may or may not be able to do what you want, you will be heard, and we will strive to make the best decision possible. We'll begin with the presentation from staff and then open the public hearing. If anyone in the audience would like to speak, you can fill out one of these request to speak forms and bring it forward to staff, and we'll make sure you get put on the label. Just a reminder, the Planning Commission will not make a final decision on this tonight. We will, however, be making a recommendation to the City Council, who will hold their own public hearing before making a final decision. So as a reminder, we are an advisory body to City Council. Our recommendation is not final, and the City Council will have another opportunity to weigh in at their public hearing, and then they will be the final decision makers. Okay, we will begin with the presentation from staff. Alyssa Hansen with the Planning Division will make the staff presentation.
All right, thank you. So as you mentioned, tonight's public hearing is on amendment to Eugene's Land Use Code, Chapter 9, and the purpose is to expand where in the city that secondary dwellings or accessory dwellings are allowed. And this would be achieved by increasing the number of zones where they are permitted outright. This is considered Phase 1 implementation of Senate Bill 1051, which is legislation that was adopted in 2017 to address housing affordability. One piece of that legislation speaks to secondary dwellings and about where, well, I'll just quote it for the record. A city with a population greater than 2,500 or a county with a population greater than 15,000 shall allow in areas zoned for detached single-family dwellings the development of at least one accessory dwelling unit for each detached single-family dwelling, subject to reasonable local regulations relating to siting and design. So in January of this year, our city council initiated a phased approach to implement 1051. And really the intent of this is to allow for the emerging conversations that are around the community about housing affordability and neighborhood livability. So I think you're all aware here that housing is a major issue in Eugene, and there are a lot of conversations and a lot of different groups and a lot of events that are focused on housing. And we didn't want to get necessarily in front of some of those conversations. So the current phase addresses, again, where secondary dwelling units are permitted, and the existing standards would remain in place. So this would allow for secondary dwellings in 7 additional zones than as compared to what they're allowed in now. Phase 2 would be a review of our existing secondary dwelling standards, and this would happen through an inclusive public process, and it would begin following the adoption of phase 1. We haven't scoped that out completely. We're working on what that would look like, but we know it would be, definitely be an inclusive public process. For the Planning Commission, as you know, we received a couple pieces of testimony over the last couple of days. I emailed those to you, but let me just, and I gave you hard copies tonight, but let me just enter them in the record formally here. The first was a letter submitted by Eliza Kaczynski on behalf of We Can, and that was submitted yesterday, and the other is a letter from Jennifer Brigar with the Housing Land Advocates. And then there's also a memo from myself in response to a request that Commissioner Baker had made regarding lot sizes of R1 zoned lots, so low density residential zoned lots. With that, I am going to keep it pretty short. We're just really here to listen, and I'm here also to answer questions. Depending on how this evening goes, Planning Commission has the ability to deliberate and make a recommendation tonight. You absolutely do not have to do that. That's just, depending on how things go. We do have Monday, March 26th, which is a daytime meeting. We have that set aside for your deliberations. That being said, time is of the essence of this one. Senate Bill 1051 requires that we have these in effect by July 1st. So we have the City Council public hearing is scheduled for April 16th. And at that, I think we should start to hear from people.
Okay. I'd like to open the public hearing of the Eugene Planning Commission.
I'll bang my gavel.
If anyone in the audience would like to speak, please fill out that request to speak form and bring it forward to staff. Please give us your name and address before beginning your testimony. We encourage you to submit any written testimony you have as well. And you can give a copy of that to staff to be entered into the record, or if you have one for each of us, you can hand that to us. I know commissioners have at times asked for clarity when it's appropriate to ask questions, and staff has suggested that we ask those questions at the end of each person's testimony when they arise. But I think for purpose of this one, maybe we just wait till the end, if that sounds good with folks. Okay, great. Without further ado, Bill Close.
While Bill's coming up to the podium, I'm the time tracker. So what I'm going to do is I'll hold up a one.
I'd like
for
2
1
minutes,
minute.
please.
You would like 2 minutes?
Yes.
I'll give you
I'm going
5.
to sell my other 3 minutes.
Oh, you're going to sell them?
Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you.
So I'll
Chair
give you a
Nichol-
1 minute warning.
Okay, good. 1 minute warning. Chair Nicolello, Commissioners, Bill Close. You have my deadly boring and detailed down in the weeds spreadsheet, which reflects my travel through the code. And you have my much more exciting several page glossy summary letter that raises a baker's dozen worth of points. So I'm not going to elaborate any of that. My one overarching comment to the commission is, please get the city council to redirect this effort. The city council has commissioned what I might call a 10% effort to come into compliance with this statute, and it's got to be 100% effort. The statute does not allow a two-phased approach, at least if any part of any phase goes beyond July 1st. This statute was not intended to encourage conversations in communities about affordable housing. This statute was directed to do something about affordable housing by mandating cities to chase out of their codes the hostility that's there about housing, in particular secondary dwelling, accessory dwelling units. That's the city's mandate. And if the city winds up at July 1st without having done 100% of the job, that's just going to lead to a storm of litigation that's completely unnecessary. The city does not have any discretion to not 100% comply with the code by July 1st. So after I filed my materials, I looked at the letter submitted on behalf of Housing Land Advocates. Stunning letter. Wish I had written it myself. Thank you. I was going to offer to answer any questions, but you probably don't have any. Gone. Thank you, folks.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Sue Walling, against/opposed.
Just, you don't have to read those parts, really. Yeah.
Sue, I'm sorry. I totally put you out on there, and everybody now knows.
What's
Is that okay?
Oh, I didn't hear what you said anyway. Houston, we have a problem. We all recognize these ominous words that the Apollo astronauts used to indicate a crisis requiring an emergency response. In adopting Senate Bill 1051 with its provisions involving accessory dwelling units, the Oregon legislature was sending a similar urgent message to communities around the state. Oregon, we have a housing crisis. That's why I'm so concerned about Eugene's proposed response to the bill, which is something along the lines of, nah, we're good. Even though Eugene has the second most constrained housing market in the nation, the city proposes only a few minor tweaks to the code and a vague promise to revisit the issue later. This approach is, at best, inconsistent with the intent of Senate Bill 1051 to respond quickly to a housing crisis. Beyond that, it seems to me that the current proposal is also inconsistent with the actual text that the legislators wrote. Senate Bill 1051 says that cities like Eugene, quote, shall allow in areas zoned for detached single-family dwellings the development of at least one accessory dwelling unit for each detached single-family dwelling. Our current R1 code just does not do that. In fact, staff acknowledged that when R1 code changes were adopted in 2014, over 4,000 lots suddenly lost the possibility of building an ADU, based mostly on lot size restrictions. It had nothing to do with siting or design. There is no design and no site on these lots where an ADU would be allowed, even if it were just a minor remodel of an existing upstairs room. I just can't see how this complies with Senate Bill 1051. So I hope the Planning Commission will consider both the text and intent of the bill, as well as the gravity of our housing situation, and insist on a more robust and legal response to Senate Bill 1051. I also have two other requests. First, you're all familiar with the situation of First Congregational Church, which wants to build several ADUs on church property as transitional housing for homeless families. They have the space, they're raising the money, and the neighbors are supportive. All that's standing in the way is the code. So I hope you'll work on minor code revisions that would allow this and other places of worship to carry out their mission of service to the community by building on-site transitional housing. And finally, the lowest hanging fruit of all. Can we please join the rest of the world and just start calling these darn things ADUs instead of SDUs? Thanks.
Right. So John Borofsky has actually been able to join us, which is fantastic. John, do you want a moment to collect yourself and I can?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry for being late. Just flew in and the flight was on time, so I made it.
All right. Melanie Uman, I'm sorry, I'm butchering your name.
So my name is the Reverend Melanie Uman, and I serve as Associate Minister at First Congregational United Church of Christ in South Eugene. For decades, our congregation has sought to relieve the suffering of our neighbors who live in extreme poverty. And despite our efforts and all others in our community who are working toward the same goal, access to affordable housing has grown worse in our community. We are committed to working across all sectors of our community to create creatively and courageously address this great need for affordable housing. Nearly 2 years ago, we began a conversation with St. Vincent de Paul to use some of our ample church property to place 2 manufactured homes where families without shelter would have shelter and access the support of St. Vinny's staff and programs. Low-income families could have access to a beautiful neighborhood with so many amenities, excellent schools, University Park, the YMCA, wonderful neighbors, as well as the support and resources of our church family. We were and are excited, and so is St. Vincent de Paul, by this new collaboration in a neighborhood that is largely unaffordable even to middle-class families. We also hope this project might encourage and inspire other communities of faith to use their properties or buildings that could be converted to create more safe and affordable places for our neighbors to live and thrive. A member of our congregation put together this wonderful picture of congregations in our community and land that could very well be repurposed and used to, like our project, maybe provide transitional housing or tiny homes or all kinds of opportunities. Not saying that these congregations have all said that this is what they want to do, but it is good to see, I think, the visual of how many spaces of land there are just in Eugene City. So thank you. What we still believe was and is an amazing idea has been caught in a mire of city codes that others more knowledgeable than I can speak to. But here is our moment to rethink the barriers that limit collaboration and creativity. Thanks to the mandate of Senate Bill 1051 to reduce barriers for houses of worship to create housing, we are in a position together to explore ways to partner to create housing in our community. I urge you, and I urge you to urge the City Council to create new pathways that are responsive to the ingenuity of our community, that reduce barriers and encourage imagination and new solutions to ease the suffering of our community members who are without shelter. Communities of faith are a tremendous resource. We care deeply for our community. We are used to doing a lot with few material resources and leveraging what we have with ingenuity and community. And we are invested by our very identity in creating a city that lives up to our highest ideals of justice, compassion, and equity. So I ask you today to see First Congregational and others in the religious community as partners in creating housing as you review and revise planning and codes for our community. Thank you so very much.
Dylan Lamar.
Thank you. My name's Dylan Lamar. I'm an architect and developer of sustainable housing. I'm also a homeowner, and I'm also a longtime member of Buddha Temple, a local Zen community temple in West Eugene. To me, the importance of housing opportunities is very real and very, I think, critical for everyone to reach their full potential for their lives. I spent the last 10 years in Southeast Portland, where I was not able to buy a home, and for being priced out of that market, as many in my generation were, even though I'm working a very good job. That's part of the reason I moved back to Eugene, actually. The housing crisis is real. It's a crisis. It's kind of, that term's been used so much that I think people forget that it's having really damaging effects on people's lives that are trying to get started in life. So we've created these urban growth boundaries, which I think is wonderful, and I fully support them. But the land within it, the gross majority is still zoned for single-family detached housing, which is the most expensive form of housing possible. So what is even the debate about allowing as many ADUs as possible? I think a minimum of 2 per house is quite feasible. Why not allow these churches to develop ADUs? They're wonderful hosts that are integrated into existing neighborhoods. I think the potential there is just beautiful. It also allows more people to be in an area to help turn neighborhoods toward walkability, and so that you don't have the same automobile dependence. That helps build on more affordability. So I think we're still stuck with zoning laws that are meant for sprawl, car-oriented development. I think that's undebatable, but we're trying with the first step being the urban growth boundary, we're trying to get away from the sprawl model. So it's time we really rethink our current zoning laws. ADUs is like the lowest hanging fruit of that effort, but it's a first critical step, and I agree with the woman in turquoise there that spoke about the need to really respond to this time. One more point I would make is I think housing ownership opportunity is incredibly important. ADUs, one of the unfortunate things about them is that currently exist, they actually make the property value more expensive. So the threshold of entry into home ownership is actually harder. The rental possibility is improved, but the ownership opportunity is diminished. So I think it's important we be looking ahead at partitioning off ADUs to allow them to be owned outright, separate from the main house. That way, you lower the barrier to home ownership rather than raise it. Thank you very much.
Lori Haber.
Thank you. My name is Lori Haber. And did you want my address? I forgot.
Is it on the form?
Oh, yeah,
Your
it's on the
address
form.
is on your form, so you're good.
And I'm here tonight wearing kind of in my capacity as a member of the Housing Initiative Committee of First Congregational Church. And as part of what I'm going to say tonight, I have a brief handout that I was going to, I guess, give to Alyssa to make it part of the record for her to hand to all of you. To make this official. And so I'm here to ask all of you to consider, as part of this phase one, a possible change to our land use code that currently makes it impossible for places of worship to develop two SDU-like dwellings on their property for low-income households. And what is this proposed change is based on that recognition that there are barriers in the code that prevent this from happening. So as SB 1051 came out, and there's been discussions around making it more feasible for ADU development, we as a church, and you've heard the story of what we've been trying to do, realized this is applicable to places of worship, and is being able to put two small ADU-like dwelling units on a place of worship is a very feasible path for places of worship to play a role in this housing crisis, as you've already heard from others, by providing transitional housing for families, parents and kids who either are experiencing homelessness or have very unstable housing. The other thing I'd like to add, in addition to kind of the conversation locally and the section of SB 1051 that pertains to, I'm sorry, I keep saying ADUs because that's the language in the state statute, but locally it's SDU, so I apologize for my flip-flopping. Anyway, so in addition to that section of SB 1051, there are also sections 7 and 8. Sections 7 and 8 pertain directly to places of worship. That's also the term used in the state statute. And basically, what sections 7 and 8 do is they grant places of worship the ability to build affordable housing, and that is effective immediate when the statute was passed immediately. That's not something that there's a delay until July of 2018. And while the specifics of that language is somewhat vague, the intent is to make it easier for cities throughout the state to allow places of worship to engage in affordable housing. So I just want to remind people of that backdrop as well, that we don't only have Section 6 of SB 1051 to consider, but also Sections 7 and 8. So with that said, what I've handed out, I don't attempt to suggest that I have the expertise and the knowledge that all of you have and that our planning staff has. What I've tried to do is propose a change that involves the least amount of changes to the code. And so basically what you can see, my proposed change is the language highlighted in yellow, and it would be a change to Table 9.2740 pertaining to residential dwellings. And this change would allow churches, synagogues, and temples to place two small ADU-type residential dwellings on their property for low-income families, and then, of course, consistent with ADU standards, such as size restrictions for ADU standards. I'm not asking, for a place of worship to be able to put 3,000 square foot houses on their property. That kind of defeats the whole spirit and the goals of what we're trying to accomplish. And so in closing, I guess my request is that as planning commissioners, that you direct staff to consider this proposal and any other related tweaks to the code that need to be made as part of this phase 1. Thank you.
Ed McMahon.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. I'm Ed McMahon, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director of the Home Builders Association of Lane County, located at 1065 River Road. Come by any time for a cup of coffee. So as I started to print my testimony tonight, I realized my printer was bone dry of ink, so I took a picture of it. And isn't technology great? And I'm blessed to have the eyes good enough to read it, so here we go. The city has a statutory obligation to bring the code into compliance with state law by July 1st. You've been presented with a spreadsheet of code sections that need to be changed by July 1st. In fact, you've been presented with some outstanding written testimony that clearly defines the changes needed to comply with Senate Bill 1051. I'm confident that staff can employ their professional skills to accomplish the task at hand. I believe that all they need is clear direction to proceed appropriately. Whoops, there we go. And now that's where you come in. The testimony before you clearly shows that the phase 1, phase 2 approach is nothing more than kicking the can down the road. We have the opportunity to get it right here, and it could be a positive step toward doing something about our current housing crisis. Not acting on the owner occupancy issue is just one example of many changes that need to be made, and the work needs to be done by July 1st. So please, I encourage you to go to the City Council and ask them to rethink the two-phase approach and direct staff to comply with Senate Bill 1051 by July 1st. And I conclude by thanking you for your service. I'm afraid I took way too much of 5 minutes in just the written testimony we presented. Thank you for your service.
Kaylee Luna.
My name is Kaylee Luna, and I don't think that I can add too much to what's already been said except express more support. I represent a network of churches and organizations and faith-based communities that collaborate to serve the community together. And last year, a more focused team did develop to address how the churches we represent and the people in those churches and the other churches that we know might be able to be part of that solution. And others from our team couldn't attend, so all I'm here to say is express support of whatever is necessary to change code, that secondary dwellings could be developed on churches, because there are eager churches, I think, as already expressed, that would want to offer land, and then as well as the zoning that's already being discussed. So thank you, and we appreciate your work.
Daryl K. Driscoll.
We don't have a projection screen, or I'd put it up there for you. But this is the cute little tiny house that I had built in my backyard. I live in the River Road area. I am in the urban growth boundary, so I'm not actually in the city. I'm told by the city that the city dictates what I can and cannot do with my property. Before I go into many details here, I want to thank you for your many hours of service, your volunteer service. I'm really appreciative of all the hours that you spend. So 30 years ago, I bought a modest home in the River Road area. It cost me $40,000. And then in 2016, I made my final house payment after a 30-year loan. I'm a substitute teacher with a modest income. So 18 months ago, I thought I need to have some income in my retirement. I know I'll put a tiny house in my backyard and rent it out. Well, everything was going along fine until I got a notice from the city saying that someone had complained. Well, unfortunately, my naivete, I found out that I was supposed to get permits. I was supposed to have a foundation. I was supposed to have insulation. Ay, ay, ay. Even though I had a reputable contractor build this 192 square foot shed in my backyard and put a $40,000 whole new loan on my house to get it done, suddenly I'm in a heap of trouble. I don't have the money, am not willing to go forward with the foundation and all the other. So I thought there might be a lot of people here who might be interested in having my tiny house moved onto one of these properties. And so I have my cards here. It's also listed on Craigslist for $49.9, which is what I have into it. And it would make somebody an awfully nice unit. So I'm in favor of loosening the laws. So at worst case scenario, I bite the bullet and put more of a mortgage on my house and get the foundation and all the work done. And then the way it stands now, it could be a separate or an additional bedroom for my house, but I'd really like to see it such that I could rent it out, a standalone unit, whether you call it ADU or SDU, and meet my purposes. Thank you.
Matt McRae.
Hello, my name is Matt McRae. Thank you all, commissioners, as this woman just said, for the immense amount of time that you all donate and your brain power to help us make tough community decisions. I would recommend following up with a contractor because I think he may have some obligation to tell you that there were permits required. As an aside. So I'm just going to make a couple quick points. It's clear we're all aware of the housing crisis that we're facing, second only to Seattle, as I understand it. And that's why the state has put this requirement in place, and I hope that we'll go forward quickly and make the code revisions that are called for and queued up here in this session. A few minor notes. Smaller homes like secondary dwelling units can provide more and lower cost housing options. We know that, as can duplexes and townhomes. A side benefit is that smaller homes and homes with shared walls like duplexes also take less energy to heat and cool. So by doing this, we meet at the same time some of our community-wide climate goals. The increased infill that can come with secondary dwelling units and duplexes and the like also can put families living closer to services so people don't have to drive as much to get to the services that they use. An increased infill and well-done increased density can make transit more effective, again, helping us to meet some of our climate goals. The really great part is that the city, as you all know, has tremendous influence here. We can make changes now, and there are a number of changes that can be made without having any influence on the city budget. So I urge you to recommend the passage of these land use code revisions. I do hope that the next step will be queuing up the next suite of land use code revisions to consider. Things like the fact that duplexes are limited to corner lots with at least 8,000 square feet in area. City code limits the footprint of buildings in low density residential to no more than 50% of the lot. And I think we'd all agree that some open space is critical, but there's nothing magic about 50%. Parking requirements are a barrier. Low-density residential requires one off-street parking space per unit, and this can be hard to accommodate on smaller lots and increases the cost of construction. SDUs are only allowed on lots of 6,500 square feet or more, and we could address that minimum lot size. SDUs are limited to 2 bedrooms, and that limitation could be removed. There are several others, and I hope you'll queue up that next set to propose to council for their review as well. Thank you again for your time.
Karen Sachs.
Hello, my name is Karen Sachs. I'm here on behalf of NEDCO, which is the Neighborhood Economic Development Corporation. We are a nonprofit housing developer based in Springfield, and we work all of Lane County. And I'm here to echo much of what you've already heard tonight, so I'll make my comments short and sweet. We definitely feel like there's a housing crisis. We see it every day with the clients that we work with. And we really think that there are lots of types of missing middle housing that can come in to help Eugene and Lane County. And so we really think that ADUs are the first step, but cottage clusters, townhomes, row houses, the conversation needs to be more broad than just ADUs, and we'd really encourage you to work to talk to City Council and be working in concert with the city officials, with the great city staff that you have, you all on the Planning Commission, the Housing Policy Board, and local nonprofit developers, and even the home builders, as you've heard tonight, all coming together to coordinate efforts to really move quickly and expediently to ensure that code changes can happen to encourage this development. Where the demand is there, we see it every day in the work that we do, and we appreciate your support. Thank you.
Carolyn Jacobs.
So I just actually have a question to ask. Since the purpose of Senate Bill 1051 is to expand the areas where SDUs are allowed, I'm wondering whether Senate Bill 1051 overrides CC&R's codes, covenants, and restrictions. As you know, there's a significant number of areas which have so far removed themselves from any possibility of increased density by not allowing SDUs, lot divisions, etc. So since you're looking at increasing the number of areas where SDUs are permitted, then again, are you looking at neighborhoods with CC&Rs? And have you asked what are the consequences of allowing some residential areas to not participate in meeting the goals of Senate Bill 1051? Thanks.
Dan Bryant.
Thank you, Commissioners. I am Dan Bryant. I'm one of the pastors at First Christian Church on 12th and Oak in downtown Eugene. And in that capacity, we have been pleased to be at the forefront of the various alternative shelter options in this community that have just been tremendous. The Interfaith Family Shelter that began in 1990, the car camping program in 1997. We've housed over 150 people through that program in the last 20 years. We serve as a central site for the Egan Warming Center, and on and on. All of these shelter options are just woefully inadequate because we don't have the housing stock. So I wholeheartedly endorse all that's been said so far this evening, and particularly call for you to support the concept of allowing special exemption for churches, houses of worship, that I think would be a wonderful fit for so many churches in our community, and we have lots of opportunities here. Commissioner Randall is aware of the other hat that I wear. Please don't hold that against him, that he knows me. He really is a decent guy. But the other hat I wear is with Square One Villages, that has built Opportunity Village Eugene. It's a transitional program, and then is now building Emerald Village Eugene, a tiny house community of 22 tiny homes. The possibilities of what churches can do with this kind of development are absolutely tremendous. I can envision a number of churches that would have little pods of smaller versions of Emerald Village Eugene, not just 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. I'd like to see the limit taken off and allow a church to develop that kind of community and be working with those individuals and families. The greatest need we have in our community is actually for individuals and couples without children. We see them on the street all the time, and I can tell you from personal stories and the number of individuals who have income. They could afford their own housing if there was housing out there available for them. But because of all the well-intentioned things we have done, we have made housing costs out of reach for those individuals with very minimal incomes. So now we have the opportunity to do the reverse and actually create an option of housing that would be more affordable for those very low-income members of our community who deserve better housing. So I hope you will support this effort. Thank you.
Thomas Dodd.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Thomas Dodd. I live in the Santa Clara area, but I'm the pastor at United Lutheran Church at 2230 Washington Street on College Hill. This past Wednesday, I had a reminder of the need when Charles showed up at our midweek meal. Homeless fellow, and we could provide him baked potato soup and lentil soup. It's a cold night. He didn't have a place that he felt he could go. So I made an exception, said, okay, Charles, you can stay inside the building for the night. And so that was one night for one person, but obviously the need is great. Our congregation has participated in helping with Opportunity Village a little bit. We've done Habitat for Humanity builds. We have the homeless parking program at our congregation. We also have a vacant lot, well, pretty much a vacant lot. We have a small house where our intern lives, but the lot is of size that we could have one of these, perhaps 2 small homes as well. We've talked about this over the years. We've talked with St. Vincent de Paul and Nedco, and at that time things weren't coming together so well. But I think this provides a new opportunity for this. I don't think our congregation is alone in wanting to respond to just such strong needs in our community. And so thank you for considering making it more possible for houses of worship to provide shelter for many people in our congregation, or in our community, sorry. Thank you.
Eliza Kaczynski.
Hello, my name is Eliza Kaczynski. I am a member of WeCan, the Walkable Eugene Citizen Advisory Network, and I totally don't know what I'm going to do with the full 5 minutes. So I want to first draw your attention to the comments that WeCan submitted in writing yesterday. We are really concerned that the proposal put forth before you will not bring Eugene into compliance with Senate Bill 1051 by the July 1st deadline. We Can, with other groups, has been asking that the city take action to comply with Senate Bill 1051 as it relates to secondary dwelling units for some time. We have a petition that online petition that's been signed by 183 people, plus paper copies that have an additional 50 signatures. All of these are asking for the city to fully and promptly comply with Senate Bill 1051 as relates to secondary dwelling units. We also sent a letter to council signed by about a dozen different organizations asking the same thing. Those organizations included groups such as the AARP, the Home Builders Association, Live Move, and I don't have the full list in front of me. I'm totally going to forget someone who, Square One Villages, just different groups that are very interested in seeing this happen. And unfortunately, the staff's proposal is just not going to fully comply with either the letter or the spirit of Senate Bill 1051. The full text was read out at the beginning of this session, and the statement has been, we will be in compliance if we allow secondary dwelling units in zones that don't currently allow them. And that's true. That's a step that we need to take to be in compliance. But that's not the main point of the bill. The point isn't focusing on the zones that allow secondary dwelling units. It's saying that each detached single-family home shall be allowed to develop a secondary dwelling unit, at least one secondary dwelling unit. So you can't have, you could say we can't have 6 per single-family home, but it's at least one. Eugene has a number of elements in its code that would prevent that, even in zones where secondary dwelling units are currently permitted, like R1. 2 particular concerns that WeCan has regarding that relate to lot size minimums and owner occupancy requirements. There was a change in the lot size minimums in Eugene put in place in 2014. According to staff analysis at the time, this change resulted in nearly 5,000 properties not being allowed to develop a secondary dwelling unit. So 5,000 properties being said you can't have a secondary dwelling unit if you want one, that's a far cry from each single family home should be allowed to develop a secondary dwelling unit if they desire. For owners of smaller lots, the lot size minimum is a blanket prohibition on creating attic apartments, basement flats, or backyard cottages, no matter how that unit is designed or sited. The second primary concern relates to owner occupancy requirements. Owner occupancy is just not a siting and design regulation. It has nothing to do with how the building looks, how the building is positioned, how tall the building is, what the relationship is of the building to the other buildings in the area. It's about who's living in the building. And that's just not siting and design. Not having an owner occupancy requirement is not going to put us out of compliance with state law. The state doesn't say we have to have an owner occupancy requirement. Having one and determining that's not design and siting would put us out of compliance with this law. Another point that I'll make in response to testimony we heard is that the other sections of the bill that talked about houses of worship permitted right now that houses of worship could build this affordable housing provided they complied with the underlying regulations of the zone that they were in. So adjusting the housing regulations just for places of worship is a good thing, and we should make sure that houses of worship are able to do the work that you guys are doing, and that's amazing work. But fixing the underlying code doesn't just fix it for houses of worship, it fixes it for nonprofit organizations and individual homeowners who want to help us solve our housing crisis. We should be leaning towards regulations and actions that are going to allow homes to be created for people that need them. Removing or reducing the lot size minimums and removing the owner occupancy requirements are a step in the right direction. Oh, I have 1 minute. Oh, that was not you, okay. So I will just say I'm done then. Thank you.
Oh, well, You have 60 seconds.
Well, I had like the full 5 minutes, and I was kind of like, I had more to say. So.
Jenna, Fribley?
I'm also reading off of my phone, not just texting. So thank you, members of the Planning Commission, for your time, energy, and dedication to this community. I'm a local architect. I'm also a member of the Housing Policy Board, which has written a letter to Council in support of SDUs and missing middle housing. I just want to give my personal support for all code amendments that make it easier to build secondary dwelling units in all relevant zones and places of worship. And I would like to urge the Commission to jump into Phase 2 review as soon as possible. I would also like to encourage the Commission to consider an amnesty period for owners of existing non-compliant and/or non-permitted SDUs. To legitimize the units that they have built in the past. We know there are lots of them in the community because it's hard to do them legitimately. And then finally, I hope that this is the first step in reviewing the code to increase opportunities for building all types of missing middle housing, including cottage clusters, row houses, and other typologies that are lacking in our community. We need more housing, all types of housing. Thank you.
Hugh Patterson III.
Yes, my name is Hugh Patterson. Good evening. Thank you for the work you do. My comments tonight are to urge you to move on to Phase 2 rather quickly as well. In that, I would urge you to consider some things as we look at what does a future of Eugene look like. I think that I don't hear anybody talking about solar access on properties with ADUs. That's I think an important issue when we think about triple impact goals and looking at things not just financially but sustainability and the way that our city looks at the things that we undertake. In that context, with more housing opportunities, I think we should also be looking at issues like neighborhood commercial. So at one time I lived on Columbia Street, and around the corner from me was the Eugene Bakery. I particularly liked Saturday mornings where I could go get a loaf of chocolate cherry bread. That is no longer an option, but where do we go in our communities that are walkable for small commerce places like that? So I am a person of faith, and I go to a community of worship, and I am greatly encouraged by what I have heard tonight and these houses, these communities, and these members of houses of worship and what they're doing in our community. And I would ask you as a committee to think in a forward way about what happens when we do subdivide a house, subdivide a property that has an ADU, and make those ADUs sellable. What happens when a church wants to sell an ADU? And those are decisions and impacts that I don't hear people talking about, but I hope that you as a committee do think about those things. In my own case, I do have a house that was built in 1959, 3,500 square feet, and I and my wife in 2015, when we bought the house, we were somewhere near the Alice line, which is, if you're following the discussion on affordable housing, it's hard to get a house at that level. So for us, affordable housing and available housing is a real issue. And for us, one solution was to find a house that had space that we could use in alternative ways. Including renting a portion of it out. So that meant that a house with an ADU became more affordable for us in our context, rather than pushing the price of a house out of ability to acquire the home. So we were able to acquire a loan, and we were able to offset some of the costs when talking with the bank because we had a place that we could rent out with an income stream. So it's not foregone conclusion that an ADU on a property will make it more expensive or put the housing out of reach, because it just wasn't the case in our case. And secondly, or lastly, let me say it this way. I would urge you to be careful with hard and fast numbers for accessory dwellings on church lots. It may be the case that some churches have opportunity to provide greater solutions quantitatively, and other churches may not be able to provide so greatly, but we wouldn't want to hinder a great benefit to our community when from being able to happen by a minimum or a maximum requirement that's set numerically rather than in some sort of ratio. So thank you for the work you do, and I trust that you will be forward thinking in your planning and such. So have a good evening.
Amy Pincius.
My name is Amy Pincus, and thanks. I'm a landlord and a property developer in Eugene. I've also been progressive media and done all kinds of different things in Lane County and Eugene, farming, gardening, you name it, and raised 2 kids here, and right now we're developing 3 houses, building 3 houses over on Sandy Drive in the Oakway area. Years ago we bought a home down on Oakway, down on Cal Young, that had a ADU. And we bought it and we rented the house, 3-bedroom house, and the 1-bedroom cottage separately. And we did that for over 10 years successfully, and helped to pay our son's college costs through that income. And then we had a disgruntled tenant who left a huge mess and turned us into the city. So I'm not the only landlord in Lane County who has has a secret, which is that we have an ADU, a secondary dwelling unit, that we've been renting out and providing housing for people. So there's a whole wealth of ADUs that are out there that nobody's talking about. And you could also just, as someone mentioned earlier, create a process to legalize those so that landlords don't have to go through what I went through, which is to pull out a kitchen, and to make the building satisfy the City of Eugene planning department's criteria. And now we can only rent the house and the cottage together, and that's okay, but it's foolish because we lost the ability to rent a cottage, a lovely 1-bedroom cottage, to 1 or 2 people and give them affordable housing. So I would ask that you open up that doorway so that landlords can come through with an amnesty situation and go through whatever planning process is needed to legalize, make their secondary dwelling units, their additional dwelling units, whatever you want to call them, legal. And that will immediately start giving you more housing in Eugene, Springfield. I mean, people are going to come out of the woodwork, because I know lots and lots of people who have additional dwelling units. And maybe you could stop the City of Eugene planning department from going after people and just have them be brought into compliance to whatever your new regulations and permit system will be, so that people can take advantage of existing housing that's already there that just needs to be brought out of the shadows. And then stop punishing people who've been providing housing. You know, I'm building housing, I do rentals, I talk to people who have rentals all the time. I fully support providing as much housing and low-income housing to people as possible. Housing is a human right. It is not a privilege, but that's how it's lining up now. Oregon's becoming more populated, and only the people who are privileged who can afford to get into a house can get into a house. If you provide more housing, that's going to level out the rents, plain and simple. It's just logic. It's a cost that's literally driven by whatever the market will bear. So thank you very much for your hard work and for your consideration of my comments and other people's comments. And let's just try to give as many people homes, safe, clean, decent, warm, and loving homes as possible. And let's start by bringing all the ADUs out of the shadows. Thank you.
Bill Aspergen?
My name's Bill Aspergren, and I live in South University area, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. We've talked about a lot of different things today. Everybody wants to change the code. I think we need to have some discussion before we start changing code around and everything. First Congregational Church. It's in the South University neighborhood. I'm on the South University neighborhood board. We certainly approve what they want to do. But ADUs and SDUs are not relevant to what they're talking about. The Section 8 of Senate Bill 1051 does talk about it, and I think probably we need to get some clarification on that to make sure that they can put a couple of smaller homes on there. But they're not putting ADUs out there. They're not putting SDUs out there. That language should be, if we stop talking about those, let's talk about putting a couple of houses there. And we support this. We want to see this happen. But let's get the terminology and everything straight. Before I talk about I'm going to go into a couple of things here from previous discussions. Lot size equals density. R1 density maximum density is 14 dwelling units per net acre. The reason those lot sizes were changed to the smallest, I think it's about 6,300 or 6,500, is because the city was illegally allowing SDUs that bump the density of R1 areas up beyond 14 dwelling units per net acre. If we're going to allow that, we need a big community discussion about it. Lot size should be taken, it is what it is because it meets the density, okay? As this poor woman found out, SDUs are not affordable. They're not inexpensive. They cost a lot of money to build, and if you build it without a permit, it's cheaper, but it's illegal, and you get in trouble for it. I testified at Planning Commission meetings some time ago, and I think I gave you some information. To build a 600 square foot SDU probably costs between $75,000 and $90,000. And I think I provided you with some information on that. So, it's hard, without subsidies or some other incentives, it's going to be difficult to build SDUs that are affordable. And illegal SDUs, I'm sorry, but that's part of the problem. We have seen this stuff abused immensely in our neighborhood, and, it may be affordable, but it may not be, and it also creates other problems. And it's even eliminating owner occupancy. There is a good reason for that. If we eliminate that, you end up with everybody with a rental house is going to put an SDU in the back. You have you increase your density. You get hidden density in there, parking problems, all kinds of things. There's a reason, and at any rate. Okay, I'll try to go through my comments rather quickly. My comments really only apply to R2, 3, and 4 because those are the areas I'm most familiar with. They may apply to the special zones that were in the in the proposed changes. Eugene complies with Senate Bill Test 1051 without making any changes to SDU standards. They comply right now. I don't think, if somebody doesn't believe that, let them challenge it. I don't think that's true. An additional building or dwelling unit is currently allowed in R2, 3, and 4 areas and not subject to Eugene's reasonable SDU regulations. As an example, several years ago, the single-family home at 1939 Hilliard, which is an R3 property, was purchased by a developer and then that developer built a multifamily building behind it. Could have been one unit, happens to be many. However, I support the changes that have been proposed, and if the current SDU standards are retained and changes only apply to zones where single-family homes are allowed. More about that in a minute. Implementing the proposed changes supports the fact that a small neighborhood-compatible mother-in-law cottage or addition or a small rental unit is appropriate for an owner-occupied single-family home. Removing reasonable SDU regulations to effectively allow a full-size house would change the definition and the intent of SDUs. I've exchanged emails with Gordon Howard of DLCD and attached the email to the stuff that I've handed out. The fourth paragraph of Mr. Gordon's response discusses how allowed uses might affect the proposed changes. I asked Alyssa Hanson if single-family homes were currently allowed in R3, R4, and she answered yes. I question if this is true. To maintain minimum density of 20 dwelling units per net acre, a single-family home could not be built on a lot larger than 2,178 square feet. Since the minimum lot size for such a home is 4,500 square feet, a new single-family home in R3 or R4 zones should not be an allowed use. And existing single-family homes, of which I own one in R3, are legally non-compliant. If this is true, then according to Mr. Gordon's email, SDUs are not mandated in R3 and R4 zones. I hope you will discuss this and resolve this question before moving further ahead on this change.
Bill, excuse me. So if you've got this in the written statement, you're over by a minute. So if you can kind of wrap it up, that's great.
Okay. Well, I'll read the last thing. I also support what Carolyn said about CC&Rs. I think Senate Bill 1051 overrides that. Spread the joy, There's little reason to move ahead with Phase 2 review of SDU regulations. Further work on this is a waste of money and resources. Adequate standards are in place defining SDUs that are compatible with the neighborhood. Thanks a lot.
All right, I have no more request to speak forms at this time. Just to check in, was there anybody who wished to speak who has not done so already who would like to fill out a form? Ma'am, yes, would you like to come up and speak, and then we can just have you fill out a form afterwards? And please just state your name and your address.
I did fill out a form, but I didn't think I wanted to speak. So my name is Janet Peterson.
I have her form.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I live in the River Road area on an almost half-acre lot, and it's a big house. It's like 2,900 square feet, and my husband and I bought it 30 years ago. We lived next door to Daryl, and we raised our daughter in it, and she raised our 4 grandkids in it, and her husband. They moved away, but they'd like to move back. And I like my peace and quiet. I would like to build a secondary unit on our property so that I have a place that I can retreat to. I would like to build my own mother-in-law cottage. I don't see where any of this is addressing the non-city properties in the River Road area. We cannot become part of the city right now because we don't have any lots that are contiguous to ours that are city. So I've been told that there's like no way, even though we've got this large lot, that we could build legally. And I'm not going to proceed unless it's legal. Thank you.
Thank you. Dennis, are you interested in speaking as well? Okay.
My name is Dennis Cassidy, and I just put a tally mark down for me in support of ADUs. And I would encourage the city of Eugene to move forward and not stand behind Springfield in the fact that they have temporarily suspended the system development charges for ADUs. I would encourage Eugene to jump up and do the same thing. Thank you.
And you know what? You can give that actually to Alyssa. I'm going to be a little bit lazy.
Thanks, Dan.
Is there anybody else left who would like to speak who's not done so already? Okay, I also did not hear any request to leave the record open. Bill, are you petitioning to leave the record open? Yes, let's discuss it. Folks, are we okay with giving one more week for public testimony?
Scheduled for deliberations the 26th, is that right?
Yes, and keep in mind too, of course, we will consider all of the testimony before us prior to our deliberations, so extending the record open would just permit for more to come in. So really what we're asking is if we're really interested in that.
Staff have any problem with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, just as long as it's not longer than a week. I mean, we can make it work if it's a week.
Okay, Commission? Okay, we will hold the record open for 7 more days.
So that meaning it will close on March 13th at 5 p.m.
All right, March 13th at 5 p.m.
That need to be a motion, Alyssa?
Believes. I think we have to first, do you want to make a motion and then close the public hearing, or would you like to?
Why don't we have a motion just to be safe?
Okay.
I move to leave the record open for 7 days.
I second it.
All right, let's have a vote. All in favor? Opposed? All right, hearing none, the motion passes. At this point, I'll now close the public hearing. And just as a reminder, that record will be held open to, you said March 13th at 5 p.m. All right. Is there any staff response to the testimony offered this evening? We did have a few questions from folks regarding CCNRs, and then another one regarding county property within the urban growth boundary.
I can speak briefly to the county property. We are in conversations with the county to move forward with amendments to that version of the code. So what you're looking at tonight only applies within the city limits. We're proposing to make some similar and maybe slightly different changes to the version of the code that applies between the city limits and the urban growth boundary. So more to come on that, but that is a county process. So the City of Eugene Planning Commission and City Council will not be involved.
Okay. Commissioner Taylor?
Alyssa, is that process have the same deadline for 1051? So will the county expedite that process as well?
We're working on that.
Okay.
Do we have any questions that commissioners wish to ask its staff? I'm sorry, folks. Okay, I saw Commissioner Jaworski and then Commissioner Randall.
One of the issues raised and might help us, or at least me, from reviewing a lot of code is, in fact, can we have a phase 1 and phase 2, a legal opinion that would be appreciated and that could expedite what I need to review in a briefer amount of time.
So, pardon me. Commissioner Jaworski, my understanding of direction from council when these code amendments were initiated is that council's understanding would be that there would be a phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 would focus on where SDUs would be allowed in the city, and phase 2 would focus on the standards applicable to SDUs. That said, the Planning Commission gets to make a recommendation to the City Council, and your recommendation could be more expansive than the proposed code amendments that are in front of you now. So if you wanted to go beyond the kind of the where, as we're calling these proposed code amendments and recommend that the council do other things, the commission has that ability.
Commissioner Randall?
And I guess my questions are somewhat related to the legal aspects of it. We heard quite a bit of testimony related to churches and housing, and that really didn't seem to be addressed in any of the Phase 1 issues, but yet I know it is in Senate Bill 1051. I'd be interested in maybe, I don't know if there's a legal opinion on should we be doing something as well, expanding on that to include that in whatever we recommend to council. And you can bring this back to our deliberations, is fine. So that's the first one. And then the other one relates to just the kind of the definition of siting and design. And that seems to be the big, I don't know if that's the elephant in the room, but it's certainly one of the hot topics of what that really means and how that relates to owner occupancy and lot sizes, and those sorts of things. Those are the things I know I'm going to be looking at as I go through all of this, and the things that I'm probably most concerned with.
So Commissioner Randall, to take your first question first, the thing that I can talk to you about tonight is, as some of the testimony mentioned, Senate Bill 1051 encompasses various sections, and the section that we have been focusing on with these particular code amendments is Section 6, which talks specifically about accessory dwelling units and where they need to be allowed and what kind of standards should apply. A separate section, Section 8, amends ORS Chapter 227, which is specific to city land use issues, to give some more flexibility to uses that are allowed on church property. But part of that amendment specifically says that the housing or space for housing that's contemplated by those amendments to 1051 must comply with applicable land use regulations and meet the standard and criteria for residential development for the underlying zone. So as I read Senate Bill 1051 and its the pieces of that bill applicable to housing on church property, it's saying, hey, we think that it's a good idea to have some of these uses available, but those uses still need to comply with the underlying code. If Planning Commission wanted to recommend changes to our current code to make it easier for churches to develop affordable housing on their property, that's something that you could do. But unlike the SDU requirements, because that section of Senate Bill, the section of Senate Bill 1051 related to churches refers back to our existing code, there's no requirement that you make changes to the code. So that's why that piece of it is not in front of you now. That from a legal perspective, the timing is less critical. From a housing perspective, you may find the timing just as critical, but that because Section 8 of 1051 doesn't have that same timing requirement legally as the SDU piece, that's why that's not included in the changes before you.
So to clarify, maybe if I can follow up, if a church, let's say, is on R1 property, which I think a lot of churches are, then they would necessarily by right be able to do an ADU?
I'll defer that to Alyssa, but I think the short answer to that is no, not necessarily. We would look to our land use code to see what development was available in that zone.
That's why I think we need to clarify it.
Okay, Commissioner, oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, and I just to answer Commissioner Randall's second question, what is siting and design? That is a great question. Those terms are not defined by Senate Bill 1051. So that is an open question. What are reasonable regulations relating to siting and design? And unfortunately, the legislature didn't give us that guidance.
Yeah. Okay. Got 2 commissioners in the queue. No worries. Commissioner Taylor?
Going back to siting and design, I have the same question. So within this process, are you going to give us some direction as to how the city's going to define it, so we can potentially use that to evaluate this process? Or is it something we're going to leave?
That's a good question. If it's something that would be helpful to the commission, you could you could ask for staff to provide more information about our best guess as to what we think that means.
Can you provide us with your best guess?
Sure.
And the next question, I just wanted to make sure, because there was quite a bit of testimony on the phasing and encouraging kind of expediting the second phase. I just want to confirm this approach, you've allocated sufficient time in order to meet the deadline for both phase 1 and phase 2, even though you're saying there's a public process.
So phase 1, it meets our deadline, meets that obligation. Phase 2 is actually proposed to begin after phase 1. And it is, so council did direct that that's how we phase this work, because we didn't think there would be enough time, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but that being one of them.
Can you do me a favor, and just, it would be great even if you gave us a link or the copy of those notes from the city council discussion.
Absolutely.
On the purpose and reasoning. That would be great.
And they were attached, I will give you more, they were attached to the January, you all had a work session where I gave you an overview. But I will bring them back up.
Great,
so.
Great,
okay.
Perfect.
Yes.
I have Commissioner Broski in the queue.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody that came out and testified. It helps us to look at what all these issues in several different people's eyes, which is what we needed to do. I think that as the state gives us laws, and as vague as they have been when they're drawn up at the state level, it comes down to local jurisdictions to interpret those laws. And then at that point, it comes down to local citizens like us and like you to look at that and figure out what is reasonable. And I think that is one of the roles that this commission is going to have on this issue, figuring out what is reasonable. I don't think it's necessarily staff's position to decide what's reasonable. I think that's what we were appointed to do to a certain extent. We can get direction from staff what they think may be defensible as reasonable, and I would hope to get that. Some of the things that I am hoping to get from staff to go into deliberations on is at our work session that we had back in January, the idea of churches and putting more units on churches was brought up, and I thought that might be something that we might be able to put into phase 1, the old lighter, quicker, cheaper. It doesn't sound like it's lighter and quicker, but I still think it's worth having the discussion over. So if staff can come back and say, this might be a way that we can do this, and if us as planning commission decides that is a way that we would like to move forward, I personally would like us to do as much as we can to try and sort out that issue before phase 2 starts. It may not be able to happen, but if it can, I would really like to see that happen, because time is money. Another thing that I would like to get a little bit of help from staff from is the idea of density, the 14.1 and the lot size, and what our legal problems are with that. You know, that was brought up as somebody who sat in on those deliberations back when we did the last code amendments. You know, we did a lot of work, and there was a lot of different people that were sitting out here testifying to us back then. Back then, the testimony was not so much about we need to get more housing into neighborhoods. The testimony was about we need to keep our neighborhoods livable. And that's what the testimony, and that's what a lot of the things that came in, at least for me when I was working on those things, was neighborhood livability. So I think that's the other side of this coin, that we have to look through this as we're being reasonable and trying to get things going. So lot size and the applicability of making smaller lot sizes and the density code, if that means changing other portions of the code to say that R1 has a higher density, I need to know about that. And then owner occupancy is the third idea.
I have Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Taylor in the code. Prior to Commissioner Taylor going, actually, you know what? everybody else has spoken, so we can go again.
You have.
Oh, Baker.
Well, yeah, Commissioner Baker's coming up next. All right, Commissioner Baker, all you.
In the queue, I think you meant
Yes.
rather than in the code.
In the code?
Oh, did I say in the
That's
code?
all right.
We're thinking.
It's 7:25. My brain is mush.
I know, right?
Go forth.
Well, a couple of things. One is I was hoping that maybe when you're sending us some links, you might include a link to the entire language of the Senate Bill 1040, because most of the text that we've seen in the staff briefings have focused on Section 6, not on Section 8. And I don't know if any of the other sections have any wording that might have any interpretation on the sections we're talking about. So maybe we should really look at the entire thing. Also, I was wondering if it's likely that there may be any interpretations from the land, DLCD, or between now and when we're, a month from now when we're deliberating, in which case that might have an impact on our discussions and our deliberations. And based on some testimony we had, related testimony today, but during a previous meeting, there was some issue with churches that they could either add 1 unit or 3 units, but not 2. And if you could clarify at least what that, that sounds a little strange to me. If you could do 1 and 3, 4, and 5, but not 2, that seems strange. So I'd just like to better understand that. And those are the 3 issues that have not already been mentioned by others I wanted to mention. And also related to the density question, I believe that there's one definition, but I thought there might be some special area. I think one of the special areas had originally proposed a slightly different definition for density. I don't know if that was ever approved or not. I think it was the west
side.
Yeah,
could be.
It was the more recent section in that southern section of the west side. And I don't believe it was adopted, but I'm not certain. So without reading the detailed language, but maybe you could at least bring that to us, because there was a large discussion about the calculation of density, I believe, as part of that, the deliberations for that consideration. And thank you very much. And I appreciate all the comments from the public. Again, it's really useful to have a diverse set of points of view, because then we're exposed to the issues that that we're likely to have to discuss in our deliberations. And this one is, phase 2 will really be the more difficult determination probably than this one.
Okay, I have Commissioner Taylor.
So I wanted to kind of bring up, just because it actually gets to what Commissioner Randall talked about, and that is some of the underlying code sections. So Lori with First Congregational Church has proposed some land use change for phase 1. And one of my questions, for instance, is churches, synagogues, and temples on R1 are not allowed without a CUP. So you've got an existing church, temple, et cetera, with an approved CUP for the property. So essentially, if this was something we would consider, which is this permitted one-family dwelling, and then churches would be allowed to, and she's got some language here. Essentially, you're still having to then address the CUP, and so that's my question. And the other item that I would like to bring up that just is that underlying zoning, if we want to, because we had a lot of voice from the faith community, is multiple family units are allowed with a PUD. And there are many places in the code that a PUD is allowed or a CUP. So I'm wondering if looking at multifamily being allowed on churches, synagogues, and temple sites rather than a PUD but a CUP. That would allow affordable housing and a diversity of number and on places of worship, and that could be expedited first. And obviously, I know this will be part of phase 2, but one of the reasons places of worship, especially like First Congregation, is that you've got 3 neighborhoods that have very specific language in the code that are preventative in terms of some of the things they want to do. So looking at that.
Right, I don't see any other commissioners in the queue. So just to remind everybody, our public record will close March 13th at 5 p.m. and we will have deliberations Monday, March 26th at 2018 at 11:30 a.m. It'll be in the Sloat Room, and that's on the first floor of the Atrium building. And just wanted to say thank you so much for coming out tonight. We are so lucky to have such an incredible community, and everybody in this room cares. Thank you again.
All right.